G'day, it's Graham here. Welcome to Doesn't Matter. I want to talk a little bit about kindness. Kindness is um, what appears to be a fairly obvious concept. Okay, compassion, empathy, sympathy, solicitation, care, concern. All these things, all these expressions are aspects of kindness. Um, But there's a lot more to kindness than simply those things, and they can be expressed in a variety of ways, probably beyond what would seem to be obvious. So kindness can be somewhat counterintuitive. Sometimes you've got to be cruel to be kind, if you've heard that phrase before. Um, Sometimes you have to deliver hard truths or unfortunate news that needs to be heard, and there's no way to be there's no way to do it easily. It's going to be painful, and yet it is the kindest thing to do. Again, it's a counterintuitive context because persons may become sadder and more unhappy and be less comforted than they were previous to that. However, you're still being kind because you're doing so in the most sensitive possible fashion, and you're offering solicitations and support and help afterwards, or during the process and afterwards. So kindness takes a number of different forms. It seems in sort of the very polarized world of 2021 that more and more people see kindness within a box, a framework of their own making or of their own adoption, most likely, according to an ideological or theological um, concept, pre-concept. So the priori concept is that, kindness is framed like all of their other ethical structures within that framework. There are dangers that rest in this. Polarization is almost never any good. It's sometimes inevitable, but it's not a good thing. And it leads to this kind of compartmentalization of ethics. One of the things about ethics that I like is that ethics, they're not universal. They're one of those useful fictions, which I'll talk about in another video. But ethics have a very broad brush that they paint across the canvas of life, and you can apply them in a whole variety of ways. You can apply them throughout your life in almost every context. They'll apply somewhat differently, and that's where polarization and compartmentalization run counter to that understanding. Because they try to make ethics work according to an ideological presupposition, and i.e., human rights take this form. Human rights exist because of this historical context and these preceding events. Human rights, as a result, are this. The problem being is that that's all bullshit. We have some consensus on history, not a lot. We have some consensus on what we might draw from historical lessons, and what we might draw from the very limited knowledge we have of society even 100, 200 years ago. But there are severe limitations as to what we can do. And in recent years, it's always happened. Religion has always done it. It's always painted a very broad brush, and politics has followed suit with great enthusiasm. Ideology and theology have a tendency to box up history and say it's all about this. It's all about the divine mandate of Jesus Christ or Allah to, cleanse and purify the world and introduce righteousness and create the righteous kingdom, the caliphate, or whatever you want to call it, God's kingdom on earth. And then in more recent times, it's been racially based with the Nazis. It's been class based and power based with the Marxists and now neo-Marxists. It's gender struggles, it's ethnicity struggles, it's sexual identity struggles, and then we have the whole identitarian movement, which started in the right but has been fully adopted by the left. And they all try to box up these broad-based ethics like the golden the golden rule. You know, do unto others as you would be done by. Um, the great elements of wisdom that have existed across traditions throughout history and have formed ethical frameworks that branch between cultures. And they've tried to codify them. The problem with codifying them is that you have a tendency to limit what they actually do and limit their actual use. So I'll give one example because I want to keep this video fairly short, and I'll make more videos on this subject. I love multiculturalism. I actually thoroughly enjoy it. Whenever I find myself in an area that is hugely dominant in one given culture, after a little while, I find myself a little uncomfortable. Still enjoying myself, I'm soaking in the differences and so on, but I find myself a little uncomfortable because I have grown up in a very multicultural society where I get used to seeing different skin colors, hearing different languages, seeing different people, different ways, different manners, different clothing. It's wonderful. I love it. But I also understand at the same time how people who grew up in more homogeneous areas or cultures might really also appreciate that. And there's nothing inherently wrong with being a multicultural nation or a homogeneous nation. There's inherently no ethical or moral superiority either way. And there are people that would claim that isn't the case. Again, they're full of shit. Sorry to not use a more advanced and pleasant philosophical vernacular, but that's the truth. They're full of shit. They're trying to, again, codify the way people feel into an acceptable model. I didn't like the Inquisition the first time around. I didn't like the tyranny of the caliphates. I don't like it now. Whether the right-wing neo-libs do it, or fascists, or whether the left-wing loonies do it. I don't like it. It's craziness. And yes, I'm using some ad hominems there, but I feel that they're appropriate under the context. Okay, people are unbalanced, crazy, out of control when they try to codify such vast and contextually complex concepts into one model that suits their pre-existing beliefs. Frightens the hell out of me. It allows you to demonize the other. Okay, they're so busy in many cases trying to make sure they're not the other and protect their others from everyone else that they other the people that they're afraid of. And that leads to demonization. It leads to precisely the kinds of things that they're afraid of having done to them being done to the others who are now othered. Sorry about that, but it makes sense if you think about it. People want to live in their own culture. No problems with that. Is it realistic? Probably not. Most OECD countries and an awful lot of non-OECD countries are now falling below or at replacement rate. That means they're not replacing their populations. They're going to shrink unless they migrate. Lots and lots of people every year into their country, from countries which have higher than replacement rate growth. This means that over time, the existing culture of the country changes. Okay, might take centuries or even millennia in some cases to completely change it, but eventually it will be significantly different. In a matter of decades, you can see in the UK and elsewhere where local cultures that have been quite dominant have been changed by the advent of migration. Poles and Pakistanis and Indians in the UK are a good example of it. I think it's a good thing. I enjoy that. You know, vive la différence, as the French would say. But I also understand people who loved seeing their culture, grew up with their culture, multiple generations of that culture. That's not wrong. And there are people out there that will tell you that's wrong. It's not my preference either. But I don't have to shit on someone else's preference to have my own. And that's what we have now, is this thing where you're racist, you're prejudiced, you're biased if you prefer this culture to that culture, or you prefer Devonshireese to curry shops. Well, I happen to like both. So that suits me very well. But I can see how it might not suit people who don't like curry, but they prefer Devonshire tea or steamed, boiled food. Not taking only a small poke at the former English diet anyway. But that's what they prefer, and that's okay. Dutch people eat roll mops. Yuck. Okay, those little fish. Yeah, but God bless them if they like to do it. Okay, we have to be able to live with preferences. I mean, you can't just choose. Okay, I can prefer my sexuality. I can choose what identity I have, what gender I have, regardless of my sex. I can choose all kinds of things: the clothes I wear, the food I eat, what I like, where I go. But I can't choose to like a place and a culture more than another. I can't choose to prefer I prefer a particular look to another because that might be deemed racist. Okay, so if you're a gentleman and you like black girls more than you like white girls, that could be deemed racist nowadays, or vice versa. If you have you prefer I don't know, subcontinental culture to Chinese culture, that could be deemed as racist. You prefer Western culture to some other culture. You just think on the balance of probabilities and comparisons, you prefer one to the other, just like you prefer eggplant to courgettes, or you prefer potatoes to sweet potato. It's a preference. That's not allowed. That's not allowed. And that's equated as some heinous form of prejudice or even racism. And it's not. It's not. If you're saying that someone is inferior or superior, that's a different kettle of fish. But even then, it's not racist to say, I think there are some strengths to subcontinental culture, and I think there are strengths to UK culture or traditional UK Anglo-Saxon culture, and I compare them, and on the balance of it, I prefer one over the other. I feel the balance of strengths culturally suits me, at least, and suits people like me better in this way than that way. That is not racist. That is not prejudice. That is simply the exit, and might contain some bias because it's a preference, and all preferences have bias built into them. But bias isn't bad. Bias allows you to make choices based on what suits you, what you like, what works for you. Okay, bias becomes bad when you're projecting it outwards and saying that culture's shit, that culture doesn't deserve to survive. I don't want that culture here at all. Okay. Now there are people who will do that, who are part of the people I sympathize with, who are losing their homogeneous cultures, and that's kind of inevitable over time. But I can be kind to them. I can be generous of spirit to them and recognize the fact that change is hard. Change is really difficult. Anyone who's been divorced, anyone who's had a broken home, anyone who's lost their job, had to move or shift for reasons that they didn't want, they know what that's like. They know the feeling of displacement, of discombobulation, of chaos that seems to enter their life when constants that they've relied upon, that they've grown up with, change. And if you can't show sympathy for people like that, if you can't be empathetic while understanding that change is inevitable, you don't have to subscribe to someone's beliefs to be kind to them, to be generous of spirit. Much of the reactionary bullshit that goes on and the polarization that goes on is because people are dumping on each other for the expression of perfectly legitimate feelings and perfectly legitimate beliefs and perfectly legitimate preferences. You're allowed to prefer whatever you want. You're allowed to. That's part of being free. That's part of living in a free and democratic culture, is that you can prefer these things. And when we lose that, when we drive that out of existence, which is a very real possibility by extreme polarization, we create a much more dangerous world, a world where it's easy to other people. And the very thing, particularly the left, seem to fail to see coming is that the more that you other people you differ with, the more likely that they are when they get in the eventual and inevitable political cycles, they get power. What do you think they will do? They will usually go further than you did in terms of the pursuit of their agenda, their polarized agenda. And if you ever get back into power on the tidal wave of outrage and anger, you will become also traumatized and further polarized, and the cycle continues, the hatred continues. This is how you get centuries and centuries of warfare and hatred. But we're trying really hard nowadays to escape in the most peaceful times in human history, the least violent times in human history. You can read Steven Pinker's book, The Enlightenment, to see all the huge evidence for that. We don't want that jeopardized. And the polarization I see, the lack of kindness. So I'm trying to be kind by suggesting perhaps that people need to widen their ideological perspectives and allow for other people to live differently, to believe different things, even things that you might find offensive or reprehensible. I find personally, on a personal level, not liking different cultures, I don't even understand it. I can't grasp how that would feel, but I can understand it cognitively, and I can sympathize with people who go, I've enjoyed the same things and so on forever and ever. We need to be able to have that. We need to be able to not throw people under the bus because they don't believe the same things that we do. We need diversity of thought, diversity of concept. If we can't have that, there's no future for us. We will just fall into ever nastier cycles of internecine warfare and conflict. Society won't be a nice place to live. We'll jeopardize everything that we've spent the last 150 years building right across the world. Okay? Cheers and thanks very much.